إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فبما رحمة من الله لنت لهم ولو كنت فظا غليظ القلب لانفضوا من حولك فاعف عنهم واستغفر لهم وشاورهم في الأمر فإذا عزمت فتوكل على الله إن الله يحب المتوكلين. We begin by praising Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We send peace and blessings upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his companions, and upon all those who have treaded in their footsteps of righteousness and piety. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those who follow in the footsteps of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that we adhere to all the commands and instructions of Allah and His Prophet. Ameen. When the Muslims migrated from Mecca to Medina, what they had in mind was, we are leaving Mecca in order to protect ourselves, in order to preserve our deen, our religion, and literally to save our lives. Because when the Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ, all his companions, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, when they were in Mecca, they were being persecuted, they were being tortured. There were many attempts made on the life of the Prophet ﷺ. To the extent that on the very day on which the Prophet ﷺ left out with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu on the migration to Medina, on that very day there was an attempt on the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And we know the story that Ali radiallahu anhu, the cousin of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, volunteered to sleep on the bed of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had been warned or given detail by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that these people are making an attempt on your life and you have to leave right now. They're going to be coming to your home tonight and they will try to kill you. Right, as plain as that. And Ali radiallahu anhu, he volunteered, right, in order to make the entire plan go work out well. Ali radiallahu anhu, he volunteered. He said, I will sleep on the bed of the Prophet ﷺ, so that when these people come, they will see that the bed is occupied. Someone is on the bed. If these assassins broke into the house of the Prophet ﷺ, and they noticed that the bed was empty, immediately what they would have done, they would have ran out and started searching for the Prophet. But with Ali radiallahu anhu being in his bed, that would have given the Prophet some more time to escape. But the reason they escaped was simply because of that very reason. Their life was at stake. After the Muslims migrated to Medina, the Quraysh, they gathered together, they consulted one another. And they advised one another, they told one another, listen, these Muslims, they escaped. We were supposed to be the dominant force in Mecca. The Quraysh were the chief. They were the chief tribe in Mecca. So when the Prophet ﷺ was able to escape from the clutches of Quraysh, all the other tribes, all the other neighboring towns, they started talking. They started saying things like, the Quraysh, they're not as strong as they used to be. They're not as powerful as they used to be. Look, a handful of these Muslims who had nothing, they managed to escape. These Quraysh, they're not that strong anymore. And maybe this is our opportunity to go and strike them and take over and become the most powerful tribe in Mecca. And the Quraysh were aware of that. So not only was it a blow to their ego, but it was also them being jeopardized. that now all their enemies, everyone that was keeping an eye out on the Quraysh, for them to fall one day, this was their opportunity for them to strike the Quraysh. So Abu Sufyan radiallahu anhu, at that moment he wasn't Muslim yet, but Abu Sufyan and a number of other the leaders of the Quraysh, they got together and they said, we have to show everyone that we are still in power. We have to show everyone that no one can escape from our clutches. We have to show them that we are the strongest and the most dominant force in Mecca. So the first battle took place between the Muslims and the Quraysh, which was known as the Battle of Badr. During the Battle of Badr, 313 Muslim men who were ill-equipped, hardly any weapons, hardly any equipment, hardly any sort of conveyance. And on the other hand, you had the Quraysh who were 1,000 strong. And they had full equipment, complete set of weapons. Each one of them had either a camel or a horse conveyances. So they were, really equipped. They were on a mission. Their mission was, we're going to wipe out the Muslims. We're going to completely decimate them so that no one can ever say that the Quraysh were outsmarted, or that the Quraysh were confounded, or that the Muslims escaped the clutches of the Quraysh. We're going to make sure no one can ever say that. And we all know what transpired in the Battle of Badr. The Quraysh, they faced defeat in the hands of the Muslims. And that was an even bigger blow to the Quraysh. Because initially, people were saying, we're kind of doubting that the Quraysh have lost their power, have lost their authority. But now, it's become so evident. You have a small army of ill-equipped men, 313 against 1,000 soldiers who were completely equipped, and they faced defeat. Now we know for certain that the Quraysh, they've lost everything. So at that point, Abu Sufyan, right before the Battle of Badr, they made another agreement that we're going to meet up for the Battle of Uhud, right? So the next year was the Battle of Uhud. During the Battle of Uhud, what happened was, again, a very similar situation whereby the Muslims were outnumbered. But being the genius that the Prophet ﷺ was, he consulted with the Sahaba radiallahu anhum and he said, we're outnumbered, and if we don't have a plan, if we don't strategize, we're going to face defeat. And therefore, we're going to plan this in a way that majority of the army is in a contact or face-to-face with the army of Quraysh. But on the other hand, we're going to have a group of 50 people who stay on our flank, who stay on our side. And what they'll do, they'll serve as a guard, a protection from the army coming around us and sneaking up behind us. So that was the plan the Prophet ﷺ proposed, and that was the plan that was implemented. So you had majority of the Muslims that were face to face with the Quraysh, with the army of Quraysh. And you had these 50 archers. The Prophet ﷺ told them very clearly that no matter what happens in the battle, you are not to leave this position. There was a small hill, and the Prophet ﷺ commanded these archers that go on the small hill. No matter what happens, you are not to leave this hill. After the battle began, after some time, it was obvious that the Quraysh were now retreating. They had suffered another defeat. And the Muslims on this hill, many of them started saying, look, our army has won, the Quraysh are leaving. If we don't go down there right now, we're not going to be able to collect any of the goods. Because the Quraysh, back then in the army, when they're fighting, if one army loses, they're going to flee, they're going to retreat. And you have to understand that they're wearing very, very heavy coats of armor. And if you're running away as fast as you can, the more you can drop, the lighter you'll be, the faster you'll be. So what these people would do, they take off their armor, leave their shields, leave their swords, and just make a run for it. Right? They don't care about anything other than life. So that's the advantage that the winning army would have, that they were able to collect all these shields, all these suits of armor, and all these other weapons, and eventually sell them or keep them for themselves. These are very expensive, valuable items. So when the 50 archers on this hilltop noticed that the Quraysh were retreating, people were throwing off their coats of armor, people were leaving their weapons and shields, a number of them began saying that, listen, if we don't go down right now, we're not going to get anything. We're not going to get anything of the spoils of this battle. And therefore we have to leave. The commander of that army, the commander of that of those 50 archers, he mentioned that he began telling everyone else that the Prophet gave us very clear instructions that we should not leave. However, there were a group of Sahaba radiallahu anhum that began saying, listen, the Prophet, we agree that the Prophet said don't leave, but the battle is over now. So there's no point in us staying. And the leader, again, he's saying, no, that's not what the Prophet said. The Prophet said, stay here no matter what. Whether the battle is over or not, we have to stay here. So from the 50 men, 40 of them decided that since the battle was over, we're going to go down to take our share of, the spoils that were there. So that left just 10 people in that area. And Khalid bin Walid, radiallahu anhu, at that point, he was not a Muslim, but he saw this. He saw that from 50 men, 40 of them had already left, and there was just 10 people left there. So he took his group of men, and he said, we can actually go around and sneak up on the Muslims and attack them from the back. Then, while we're attacking them from the back, then the Quraysh can now attack them from the front. And we can turn this entire war around, this situation, and actually defeat the Muslims. So Khalid bin Walid, radiallahu anhu, what he did, he took his army, and initially they had tried a number of times before. But because there were 50 archers, every time a group of men tried coming that way, they would shoot their arrows. This time there was only 10. And Khalid bin Walid, radiallahu anhu, he had much more people. So they just completely killed these 10 men, and they were able to go right behind the Muslims, sneak up on them, and inflict a lot of damage. However, they were not able to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish, which was completely kill all the Muslims, decimate the Muslims. They were not fortunate in doing so. Rather, they were able to inflict some sort of damage, but eventually the Quraysh, they retreated. But after that entire incident, what happened was an ayah was revealed. This ayah in Surah Ali Imran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. That at this point, imagine that the Prophet ﷺ, he gave the Sahaba radiallahu anhum very clear instructions. And before we continue on any further, we have to understand that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they are at the highest ranking in our deen, right? We don't speak ill about the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. We do not have any ill opinions or ill feelings towards the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it very clear, radiallahu anhum wa radu an, that they are pleased with Allah and Allah is pleased with them. And if Allah is pleased with them, then we have no right to be disappointed with any of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, right? But this is an incident, and this is what transpired. And the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, we know they're human beings. They made mistakes, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgave them. So when we're speaking about this, keep that in mind. That we're not speaking with any sort of contempt or any sort of hatred or ill feelings towards the Sahaba. We're mentioning an incident which transpired, and we are deriving a lesson from it. So at this point, when, after the battle ended, once they returned, you can imagine how the Prophet ﷺ was feeling. Because the Prophet was the leader. He was the one that all these men had gathered to fight on behalf of. All these people who left their families, they left because for the sake of the Prophet ﷺ. They went because they loved the Prophet. And now the Prophet ﷺ has to come back to Medina, and he has to tell all these families that, listen, your father or your son or your husband, that went off to fight, he passed away. Imagine for a leader, for someone to go and convey such a message. It's difficult. And the Prophet was very disappointed that I told you guys that, don't leave. But instead they left. So the Prophet ﷺ was very disappointed at this moment. But at this point, this is where Allah reveals this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ, that it is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the Prophet is soft-natured and soft and gentle-natured. That is the nature of the Prophet ﷺ. He's soft, he's compassionate, he's kind, he's understanding, and he's forgiving. And this is a mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intentionally made the characteristics, the traits, and the personality of the Prophet to be someone who was soft, someone who was very understanding, someone who was very kind, someone who was very compassionate. And Allah is reminding us of this, that it's the mercy, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ. It is the mercy from Allah. It is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah made the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, someone of kindness, someone of compassion, someone of forgiveness and leniency. And reason being, Allah says, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. Because if the Prophet, Allah is saying, if you were فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ, if you were someone who was harsh, someone who was crude, someone who was very ill-tempered. غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ means someone who had a very hard heart. If you were someone like that, لَنْ فَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ, then all the companions, all the Sahaba رضي الله عنهم, they would have fled, right? They would have left you. What we learn from this is that one of the strongest reasons, or one of the strongest factors that pulled the Sahaba to the Prophet ﷺ, the reason why the Sahaba رضي الله عنهم were willing to give their lives up for the Prophet was because of his gentle nature, was because of how kind and compassionate the Prophet ﷺ was. And Allah is telling us over here very clearly that if it were the other way around, that if the Prophet was harsh, if the Prophet was hard-hearted, if the Prophet was not understanding, if the Prophet was someone who was constantly criticizing, critiquing, and always looking for faults in his companions, then no matter how much love the companions had for the Prophet, no matter how much they understood that what the Prophet is delivering is the truth, they would not be able to stay in the presence of the Prophet. Because as human beings, all of us have have egos. All of us as human beings are disinclined towards constant criticism, towards constant blame, right? How long can you be with a person if all they do is look for your faults, if all they do is criticize you, if all they do is blame you for everything, right? As human beings, we make mistakes. But imagine being around a person who any chance they get, they start criticizing you. Oh, why are you doing this? You're not supposed to be doing that. And not only that, they're not even giving you constructive criticism. Instead, they're yelling, they're harsh, they're rude. They belittle people. Right? So just try to understand this. That the Sahaba loved the Prophet so much that during the truce of Hudaybiyah, when the Muslims decided that they were going to go for Umrah, the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, they went all the way from Medina to Mecca with the intention of performing Umrah. They went there. And the Quraysh sent a few envoys, a few ambassadors. And one particular emissary of the Quraysh went and he came back and he said, these people were fighting. I don't think it's a good idea. And the Quraysh asked, why not? And he said, these people, they're just in complete love and they're completely loyal to the Prophet. They're completely loyal to this man. Because I've been all around the world. I've been to the palaces of the Persian kings. I've been to the Roman courts. And never have I seen this much of devotion, this much of loyalty and love for their rulers. Because when the Prophet makes wudu, the drops of water that trickle down his body, these men, they rush to collect that. Right? So this agent from the Quraysh mentioned that I don't think it's a good idea for us to go against these people. Because we're going against a group of people that have already given up their lives for this man. If this man tells them to do something, they will do it. They will not have any second doubt. They will not think about it. Now imagine these are the very same people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that if the Prophet was to be harsh, if the Prophet was to be someone hard-hearted, if the Prophet was to be someone who did not understand the emotions and feelings of the companions, that they would have left the presence and the companionship of the Prophet ﷺ. This is not something small. This is not something trivial. This is a big, big deal that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making. That you have men who are completely devoted and loyal to the Prophet. But if simply the Prophet was harsh, if simply the Prophet was constantly criticizing, critiquing, belittling others, then that would have been enough for these loyal, dedicated men and women to completely leave the side of the Prophet, even if they understood what the truth was. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on and He commands the Prophet, فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. That pardon them. They'll make mistakes. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet. That they'll make mistakes. Leave them, Excuse them when they make their mistakes. Because they're human beings. وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ. And seek forgiveness on their behalf. So not only forgive them, but also ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness on their behalf. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. And consult them in your affairs. Meaning, seek out their opinion. Ask them what you should do. When something is going on, consult with them. These are the three pieces of advice Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That number one, when they make mistakes, excuse them, forgive them, pardon them. Number two, seek forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on their behalf. That they've made a mistake, now ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them. And number three, when you're attempting to do something or when you're about to start something, get their consultation, get their advice, get their opinions. And we see that the Prophet ﷺ on many occasions always asked the advice, the opinion, and sought the consultation of his companions. He sought the consultation, the opinion, and the advice of his wives. He would frequently ask Aisha radiallahu anha, for advice. He would constantly and frequently ask many of his wives for advice and consultation. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلَ عَلَى اللَّهِ. So once you have consulted, once you have made up your mind as to what you are going to do, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ. So once you have come to a conclusion, then فَتَوَكَّلَ عَلَى اللَّهِ. Have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and move forward. What Allah is saying that, number one, whenever you go out to do something, make sure you plan it. And number two, make sure you ask people for their advice and make sure you consult people who have that experience. When you're going out to do a major task, right? Go and take a few minutes to speak to someone who's already experienced that, or someone who's already crossed that path that you're trying to get to. If you're trying to get through a certain college or a certain school, then go and speak to someone who's already attended that place, someone who's already graduated, and find out and seek consultation. And once you have sought consultation, advice, then at that point, you've made up your decision. You've had a good understanding of what not to do, what to do, the different implications and repercussions, and you have a good idea at this point. And at this point, you make up your mind what you want to do. And whatever your decision is at that point, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, فَتَوَكَّلَ عَلَى اللَّهِ, that have full trust and full faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and move forward. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us a foolproof plan to achieving all our goals. That if we have any goals, if we have any things, whatever it is that we want to accomplish or achieve, Allah is giving us the game plan right here. That number one, go and find people who have already experienced, have the experience. Go and find people who have already succeeded and accomplished what you're trying to accomplish. And once you get their approval, or once you sit down with them and get their opinion or advice on how you should go about with it, then just have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and start. And once you start, all throughout the process, stay in touch with Allah and constantly make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant you strength. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us a foolproof plan. And then Allah ends by saying, Inna Allah yuhibbul mutawakkilin. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yuhibbul mutawakkilin. Allah loves those who have trust in Allah. Right? So it's not just a one-time thing. It's, you constantly have to be renewing your trust and conviction and faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because sometimes we have very long goals. Sometimes we have very long plans that may take years to accomplish. Right? So it's not just a one-time thing that you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala once and then you forget. It's an ongoing thing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Allah loves those who have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But from this one ayah alone, and looking at the context of it, we've learned a number of lessons. Right? We've learned a number of lessons from just this one ayah along with this context. Right? That the Prophet ﷺ came back at a very difficult stage. That the companions, a few of his companions have misunderstood and disobeyed the command of the Prophet, and because of that, many lives were lost. And the Prophet ﷺ had to take responsibility for it. Being their leader, he had to take the responsibility for it. And at that time, anyone would have been angry. At that time, anyone would have been disappointed. Right? But the lesson we need to walk away with from this is, none of us are really in that position of leadership. None of us are going out and taking an entire army where people's lives are in our hands. And the point is, when we come across those circumstances and situations in life where we're very frustrated, disappointed and angry, keep this in mind. Keep this ayah in mind. Keep this situation in mind. That the Prophet ﷺ, despite going through all this, and during the battle of Uhud, that same battle, what had happened was, because of the fault of a few Sahaba, the Prophet ﷺ incurred a number of wounds as well. One of his tooth broke. Also, a link from the helmet went into the head of the Prophet ﷺ. It was gushing out with blood. So the Prophet ﷺ also was inflicted with a lot of damage and a lot of injury. But at that point, the Prophet, Allah is mentioning to us that Allah made the Prophet very gentle. Allah made him very kind. Allah made him very forgiving. So on a day-to-day basis, we deal with our families, we deal with our children, we deal with our husband or wife, or whatever else. Sometimes we get angry at our animals, right? Especially if we have cats, right? Those things are annoying. But be kind, right? At that point, you have to be gentle. You have to be understanding. Because if Allah is saying that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum would have left the companionship of the Prophet simply because of his bad nature, then imagine, we're nowhere near the Prophet. We have no one who's that dedicated and loyal to us. If we treat our family members, our close relatives, whereby we're constantly belittling them, constantly criticizing them, constantly putting them down, never appreciating them, then this is what's going to happen. فَانْفَضُّ مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. They will leave your side. They will not want to interact with you. They will not want to have any sort of communication with you. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to understand this. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our hearts soft. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his compassion, in his kindness, in his love. Ameen. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Qur'an al-Majid wa nafa'ana wa iyyakum bil ayati wa dhikri al-hakim. Astaghfirullah li wa lakum wa lisa'il muslimin fastaghfiru innahu huwal ghafurur rahim. الحمد لله الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وصل على المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات وبارك على محمد وأزواجه وذريته قال النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام أرحم أمتي بأمتي أبو بكر وأشدهم في أمر الله تعالى عمر وأصدقهم حياء عثمان وأقضاهم علي وفاطمة سيدة نساء أهل الجنة والحسن الحسين سيد شباب أهل الجنة وحمزة أسد الله وأسد رسوله رضوان الله تعالى عليهم أجمعين. Before we conclude, I just want to mention why I chose to speak about this. Number one, it's the month of Rabiul Awal, the month wherein the Prophet ﷺ was born. And I think it's just that occasion whereby we learn more and more about the Prophet ﷺ. Although all throughout the year we're learning and speaking about the Prophet, but this month I feel that we should really emphasize and focus on the life, the character, and the traits of the Prophet, because we listen to we hear about the life of the Prophet and we just walk away without learning any lessons. But I think if we focus on the character, the traits, and the personality of the Prophet, then inshallah we'll have a better idea as to what kind of personality and character we should be aiming for. And secondly, one of the things why I started off with this was I actually read a very interesting. I was reading a book. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? It's by Dale Carnegie. And the second thing he mentions, the second point, he says that if you want to help people, or if you want people to understand you or listen to you, you have to stop criticizing and condemning people. Because everyone, no matter what they are, whether they're a crook or whether they're a murderer or a killer, they'll somehow justify their actions. You have the biggest drug dealers, these drug lords, right? They'll justify their action by saying, I'm simply supplying people what they like. They'll never look at their actions in a bad manner. And he says that, the same way how we need food to nourish our bodies, likewise, you have to nourish people's hearts by giving them praise, by giving them kind words and showing them affection. So with that being said, we understand that the Prophet ﷺ was exactly like that personality. He was that person who, no matter how severe of a mistake, the Prophet ﷺ was always understanding, and he was very kind and very generous in giving good words to his companions, whereby he made everyone feel special. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to understand this and practice. Ameen. Inna Allah ya'muru bil 'adli wal ihsan wa ita'i dhil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkari wal baghi ya'idukum la'allakum tadhakkarun fadhkuru Allah yadhkurukum washkuruhu wa la takfurun. Aqimus salah.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي